Hello, everyone. This is Joseph Schaeffer. With me today is Risa Katz-Albert. I'm the co-chair of Spilman's Technology Law Practice Group, and Risa is one of our members in our Roanoke, Virginia office. And we are excited to talk to you today about the topic of data privacy and security. Now, this is not legal advice, and watching or listening to this recording does not form an attorney-client relationship between you and Spilman, but we do hope that you enjoy the information that we're going to talk to you about today. Now, the topic of data privacy and security is a huge topic. It's not something that can be digested in a single setting. So rather than try to serve you the full meal, what we're going to do is try to give you 6 quick bites, sort of like the puff pastry that would come along with the cocktail during the cocktail hour, back when that was still a thing that we used to do. So without further ado, what I'm going to do is hand it off to Risa to talk to you about our first topic today.
Hi there, folks. It's nice to see you all. My name is Risa Katz-Albert, and I'm in the Spilman Roanoke office. And the first topic that I'm going to cover today is what is data? So data is probably something that you've heard of, but it may not be something that you've given a whole lot of thought to. And everyone kind of knows what it is, but there's some nuance to it, which is important. So the International Association of Privacy Professionals defines data elements as a unit of data that can't be broken down any further and that has distinct meaning. So if you think, for example, of someone's birth date, that's a month, a day, and a year. And in conjunction with knowing who that person is, that gives you information. It tells you about their age, it tells you when they celebrate their birthday. But the data element itself would be the birthday, so the month, the day, the year, and then if you break it down any further, it completely loses its meaning. And so it's just, March. March isn't terribly helpful as a data element. So it's the combination of the pieces that give it meaning that makes it data. And then obviously data elements can be combined with additional data elements to give more meaning. So a birthday alone is, you know what it is, it's a date. But when you attach it to a human, so a name, then you know how old that person is. And when you attach it to, various other pieces, then you can learn more about that person. So you might learn where they live, which would be their address would be a data element, and so forth. Data is definitely not all created equal, as you could probably imagine. So elements in isolation may or may not be personal data. So a social security number is a data element. It doesn't get any smaller than that, but it is still a personal data identifier because that only matches one person. So that would by itself be personal data, but then not so personal data, like say a birth date, can become personal data by being combined with other elements that gives it additional information. So that's sort of your very brief 50,000-foot overview of what data is and what data elements are and why some of it is different than others. And so now we're going to do the same sort of exploration into privacy and security because they overlap, but they are not in fact the same thing. So the same organization, International Association of Privacy Professionals, explains that information privacy has to do with individuals, groups, or institutions determining for themselves when, how, and to what extent the information is going to be communicated to others. So this has to do with how it's collected. Are you asking someone to fill in information for you? Are you collecting it from them automatically, like cookies or an IP address that logs into something? And what do they know about it? Do they know what it's going to be used for? What is it going to be used for? Is it going to be retained? All those kinds of questions are privacy questions. And then security has to do with the protection of that information that you have. So preventing the loss, unauthorized access, misuse, assessing threats, confidentiality, integrity, and availability of the information are all preservation of those things are a big goal of the security. So I know that's a lot right now, but those distinctions are really important between data elements and then privacy and security. And so very, very broadly, when we talk about data privacy and cybersecurity, we are talking about the collection, storage, use, and protection of the information that your business utilizes in the course of doing its business. So I think I'm gonna hand that back to Joseph, but we certainly can discuss any of those things in much more depth at a later date, but we are just trying to give you little bites. So I hope that whetted your appetite. And then Joseph is going to talk a little bit more about who has the data.
Yes, thank you, Risa. So our next question, who has your data? And it's an important question because one of the reasons we're talking about this, of course, is because you have legal obligations as a business, and you have consequences if you fail to meet those legal obligations. And you can't start to figure out how to respond to that if you don't know who has your data. So there are really four big categories of people under this question we want to talk to you about. And the first one is you. It's obvious. You have your data. You might have files on your desk. You might have files in your filing cabinet. You might have electronic documents located on your computer, PDF files, Word files, all sorts of drafts. You have your data. That's obvious. But you might also have vendors that have your data or have access to your data. So for example, if you've hired a cloud storage provider who is going to store some of that electronic information in the cloud so that all of your employees can access it, whether they're in the office or working from home, that cloud storage provider has your data as well. You might have someone who has access to your hard copy data. We don't think about it maybe as much anymore, but Iron Mountain, for example, is one of the best known companies that deals with the storage of of hard copy data and secure storage. You have other vendors, for example, shredding vendors who might have access to your data, or employees of that vendor who have access to your data. Of course, you might have custodial staff who come into your office to do cleaning and can have access to those documents that you leave out on your desk or in your filing cabinets. So that covers two of the categories of people that have access to your data, or at least potential access. What are a couple more? Well, one is third parties. So for example, what if you have a business associate who you contract with, not necessarily a vendor, but who you work with to accomplish your business? They might have access to your data. Or for example, if you are a financial broker, you might have an order that you place for stock, and the party who is receiving that order would have access to the data that's associated with it. That would be a third party. And then there's another really important category of people that would have access to your data, and that's your employees and your employees' family. And that's even more important now that we are in a work from home environment for many of us still as a result of this pandemic. And so you have to ask yourself, what are your employees doing when they are storing or accessing your data at home? Are they using simply approved devices? You might have a bring your own device policy, and you know what some of the where some of the data is being stored and how it's being accessed. But do they have sort of a shadow IT infrastructure, as it's called, that they've built up to do their work? And do they have family members who have access to your data by virtue of either overhearing conversations or having access to unsecured files at home, or some of the same devices? So these are really important questions that you ask yourself as you begin to formulate a compliance plan or work on expanding or auditing an existing compliance plan, is who has your data. And so with that, Risa, I'm going to turn it back to you to talk about why are you collecting the data and why are you keeping it?
Thanks, Joseph. So the answers to the questions of why are you collecting this and why are you keeping this probably varies pretty widely based on what your company does. And you know, there are some universals. For example, if you have a company and it's not just you, you probably have employees. And if you have employees, you probably have a fair amount of personally identifiable information that is necessary in order to, you know, ensure that you're meeting your human resources requirements. So you probably have information that you need for filling out their tax forms. So you may have their tax number, you probably have their social security number, you may have a scan of their passport or other ID. You may have some of their health information if you maintain insurance through your program, especially if you have the kind of the HSA type program where claims get made against your HSA program. So somebody in your organization may be inadvertently or advertently collecting information about health treatments that your employees and their families are undergoing. You certainly have their address and their phone number, their contact information. When you process payroll, you may very well have their bank account information if you guys do direct deposit, which I think is fairly universal at this point in time. So that's pretty much everybody who has employees has those things. And those are things that you probably do, in fact, need to have and you need to keep. But there are some other circumstances where the question of did I need it at one point is not the same, doesn't have the same answer as the question, do I need to keep it? So thinking specifically, if your business sells things, either goods or services, you probably collect payment information for the people who are purchasing your goods and services. And that might be credit card information, that might be bank account draft information, that might include checking account information on checks. If you're sending things or sending individuals to a service location, you might have home address information, which, obviously you need those things. You want to get paid, you want to send the items and the people to the right places. But once you've sort of successfully closed each transaction, do you really need to keep those things? And the answer to that will depend on your business. There are businesses who have regular customers who enjoy the convenience of, one-click checkout. I'm thinking particularly of online retailers right now who we're all sort of heavily leaning on during the pandemic. It certainly is convenient not to have to enter your credit card information every time. But folks do need to be aware of the fact that by storing that, you are keeping personal information, and it needs to be secure, and folks need to know that you're keeping it and why you're keeping it, and there needs to be a mechanism for them to decline that. So in addition to sort of the things that you're grabbing, information you're grabbing from people, you're probably generating a fair amount of information as well without actually actively trying to. So if your employees communicate with each other, either by phone or by instant message or by email, then that's creating data among your employees. If anybody in your organization communicates with people outside of your organization, that's creating the same kind of data. More than likely, your system automatically archives those emails in some fashion, and it may purge them after a certain amount of time, and it may not. And depending on what's going on, it may be a good thing for you to keep those emails. So Joseph and I are both litigators, so we can't count the number of times that we've gotten litigation holds or various things, and it's too late because there's this the time frame. By the time it actually gets to us, sometimes things have already been purged, and that can potentially be problematic. So you definitely want to think about, and you certainly want to talk to your folks in charge, your management people, your litigation people, risk management and counsel, and you want to figure out the right balance of how long do we want to keep this stuff because we need it and we should have it, and then okay, but do we really need to keep all of it, and how long do we really need to keep it? If you keep backups of things, so again, I'm thinking of our office, and we have everything in the computer system, and then we have an awful lot of paper floating around. So you got to make sure that when you're sort of purging something or deleting something, you got to make sure that you get all the copies of that, which is also a big potential problem if you've got a computerized system that allows things to get pulled out and recreated in other spaces. So you have to make sure that you know where your data is and where it's gone, so that if you need to adjust that, then you know that, okay, it's not just in this one spot. We've got to hunt it down in all the places that it exists. And then you should also be aware that many states, including the District of Columbia, which is not a state, but statehood for DC, have enacted laws that require folks to dispose securely of data when they don't want to retain it. And so, what that means for your specific data is a complicated question. And you definitely want to make sure that when you do go about deleting things, that you do them in a way that complies with law. And then the FTC's disposal rule and HIPAA has some stuff. So you've got sector specific things as well, in addition to state specific things. And then the last thing, I guess not the last thing, but another thing to be mindful of, there will never be a last thing. Another thing to be mindful of is whether the data that you're contemplating has a retention need. So we already talked about the possibility that it'll come up in litigation, but some sectors have very specific requirements. For example, in banking, you have to keep certain transactional records for a long time in order to do anti-money laundering act compliance. In healthcare, HIPAA has requirements about how long certain records have to be kept and then at what point they have to be purged. So you definitely want to make sure that you have a good understanding of what data has what requirements associated with it, because it may not be the same for all data in your organization. So if that's not enough to think about, Joseph is now going to talk to you about how to go about protecting your data, how you should be doing it, and perhaps how you maybe aren't.
Yeah, thank you, Risa. But before we do that, I want to pick up on a couple things that you said there, because I think they're important and worth emphasizing it. The first thing that I think is really important is that when it comes to data, you might not have a choice about collecting it. The government might obligate you to do it, for example, to comply with Know Your Customer laws. I'm reminded of signing up recently for a cryptocurrency trading account on Robinhood and having to show a copy of my driver's license to Robinhood so that they could verify my identity to meet those requirements. Robinhood didn't have a choice to do that. But not all data is created equally either. For example, information about somebody's age, for example, might be less relevant than information about their health status or information about their credit card information. And there's also an important thing to consider about how you store the data, whether it's encrypted or whether it's in plain text. A lot of companies have gotten into trouble, not so much because they've had a data breach, but because they have had a data breach and had information accessible and stored in a way that rendered it useful rather than useless to the people who had pulled it. Of course, Risa, one of the other things I thought was really interesting is your talk about online shopping. And of course, you might decide that sometimes the risks outweigh the benefits. There are risks, of course, with keeping a customer's credit card information saved for them. But if that's going to enable the customer to easily purchase goods and services from you, more so than perhaps from another retailer, you might decide that that's worth it. So really great points, Risa. On to how do you protect that data, though? One of the first things that you want to be thinking about is whether you have the right security protocols in place. For example, how are you storing it? Is it encrypted? If it's not encrypted, do you have a good reason for not having it in that format? One reason might be, for instance, if it's something that you have to frequently access to the point that it would not be practicable for you to keep it constantly encrypted. But that's something that you should be thinking about. Of course, you should be thinking about who has physical access to your files and servers. That's something that we think about in law firms a lot, but it's a conversation that should be had in other types of business. And then you should be asking yourself whether the people who have that access really need it. Maybe they do. Maybe it's a matter of convenience. Maybe it's not a big concern for them to have it. But if it's highly sensitive data that has legal risks for your company, perhaps you should think more carefully about locking that down. Should be thinking about your password requirements, and particularly in this day and age, two-factor authentication requirements, both if you have logon systems that you administer, but also if you have given employees access to third-party vendors that have that capability. Do you have logs to identify access in the case of a breach? Are your networks properly secured and configured? And if you think that they are, have you had somebody test that to make sure it's actually true? And have you responded to the results of that audit? And have you kept your software programs properly patched and up to date? One of the easiest ways that people find themselves in trouble is to have unpatched vulnerabilities in their systems because they haven't updated or because they're using old software. And that's a significant problem. Other thing that you should be considering about is whether your employees are compliant, not just whether you have the systems, but whether your employees are following them. So if you've told your employees, for example, to take certain steps, are they actually doing it? We talked about the shadow IT network and personal devices and unapproved devices. That's a really important consideration, particularly now when we have a work from home environment for many people. Of course, are your employees being instructed on security protocols? Are they being audited? There was a really interesting case involving, I won't name them, but a company in December of this past year that sent out an email advertising bonuses for employees. And when the employees clicked on that email to provide all sorts of information, they found a few weeks later that they hadn't received a bonus, but had in fact failed a phishing test. So maybe not the best way to handle those phishing tests, but it's an important thing to consider about whether your employees are aware of the risks and are trained to confront them. And then, do you have ways to monitor for unauthorized use or access? And do you have ways to turn off access for people who have been terminated? Interesting case out of Florida a couple months ago involving a woman who was involved in the COVID-19 data analysis down there, who found herself in trouble after accessing the system. So it's alleged after she was terminated or quit. And at least according to her, the way that she was able to do it is because there was only a single logon and username for the entire system, and it wasn't changed after she left. And that's not a scenario that your business should find itself in. And the last thing has to do with auditing vendors. We talked about vendors, and vendors probably have a fair amount of your data. And so it's important to know a couple of things. Do you know where your vendors are storing your data? This could be a bigger issue depending on the type of data that you have. For example, if you have sensitive data that perhaps is subject to export control restrictions, you might need to have a vendor that is only going to use data centers in the United States. Then you should know who your vendors, contractors, and employees are. And you should know what type of security protocols your vendors employ. Do they have a dedicated compliance program, for instance? Is that compliance program experienced? Is it well staffed? Are they responsive if they have an incident or if you have an issue that needs to be addressed? Have they been audited, or have they received any of the certifications that are available for people operating in this space? And have they undergone a penetration test to see if they are susceptible to hacking? The joke being that everyone gets a penetration test. The difference is whether you know about it or not. And then a couple other things that you should consider is whether they have a business continuity response plan, a disaster recovery strategies in the case of a breach or other disaster. Do they have an incident management program? For instance, if they suffer from a breach, how will they know? How will they communicate that to you? And will they communicate it to you? What circumstances would define that obligation? And then one of the things that you should also consider at the end is what's in that vendor contract, both in terms of what they require of their own vendors and also of how they allocate the risk between themselves and you. Are you, for instance, going to become liable simply because they did not undertake all of the steps that they should have? So those are the things that you should be looking for as protecting your data. I'm going to turn it back to you, Risa, to talk a little bit about the risks of when that doesn't happen or when things go wrong.
Sure. Thanks, Joseph. So obviously, this is an awful lot of work that we're essentially asking businesses to do on the front end. And the reason for that, as I'm sure just about anybody who's high up in a business, and this is super relevant for, has figured out that there is a lot to be said for planning and preparing before you have a big problem. And this is like the epitome of that type of situation where you definitely don't want to be planning your data protection system once you've had some sort of a scare or an issue. That's not the boat anybody wants to find themselves in. But if you do find yourself in it, there's some serious risk to not doing this or to not doing it properly, which we're going to cover in very, very overview detail. But basically, you're running the risk of having a security event, and a security event could be any number of things. And I'm going to stay away from the word breach because that has a very specific meaning. But a security event is sort of a colloquial breach. And it could be any number of things, from someone saying something and having it be overheard by someone in their family. That is to some degree a security event. It could be that you discover that there's a major issue in one of your softwares that hasn't been patched yet. And depending on whether or not that had been taken advantage of, that could be an event, or it could potentially be a true capital B breach in the official, scary, scary sirens going off in your brain kind of way. So the security events are the problem, and then the breaches are the really big problems. And most businesses are going to be covered by the Federal Trade Commission Act, and then some businesses are going to be covered by the industry-specific laws or national agencies. And then all 50 states plus DC and each US territory has its own requirements relating to when a data breach has to be reported and to whom and in what fashion and what kind of information has to come out about it. And a lot of these conflict with each other. So if you are, say, a company that only operates in one state, then you still have to deal with federal oversight, potential industry oversight, and then the state oversight. And then you have to consider whether, unless every single one of your clients is in your own state, you also have to consider, whose data you have in other states and which of these things apply. So that's a big risk. And then, once you have this problem and you discover that you've had an issue, a security event, you have to fix it. So it's not enough to say, whoops, sorry, everybody got, we accidentally released a bunch of information. You have to actually kind of plug the hole. And so it's important to consider how those events kind of happen. And there's sort of two different main branches of ways that security events take place. And the first is inadvertent. So this is estimated to be about 95% of security incidents and security breaches. And it's basically human error, and humans are full of error, apparently. And so this is potentially an employee who doesn't encrypt an email when they send bank records to somebody. This is folks not necessarily following all of the protocols. I actually had an example of this the other day. I got a phone call from a medical system asking me, they knew my name and they knew my phone number, and they asked me a bunch of questions about someone I'd never heard of. And they thought that it was my mother. I don't know who this person is. And that was one of those moments where I was like, probably should have led with, do you know who this is? And that's certainly something that, we reported to the agency so that they could fix that. But that could have been really bad. If that person had, started telling me about something, medical related to somebody that I didn't know. But that was obviously inadvertent. And as soon as I notified the person on the phone that I was not who they thought I was, she stopped talking, and she went back, and she knew that there was a problem. And then the other 5% has to do with hacking by a bad actor. So that can include people who are intentionally out to benefit from taking your stuff, either in a ransomware type context where they take it and encrypt it. And so you might have it, but you don't have access to it in a meaningful way. So apparently encryption can cut both directions. You always want to make sure that if you've got it encrypted, you have the key, and you don't want to keep the key in the same place as the encrypted data, because that's not helpful. But if they take it and they encrypt it and they have the key, then they can sort of extort you to pay. And that's certainly illegal, but it does happen. And then sometimes it could potentially be somebody trying to find information. So somebody trying to figure out what is in the record for themselves or for somebody else. It could be somebody trying to change information. So that takes us back to our data integrity concern. So we're not just concerned with access, we're also concerned with the integrity of the data, because when you go to pull it, you want to make sure that it's what it should be. And those are things that would be more hacking related. And then just sort of on the inadvertent disclosure end of things you don't really have as much control over would be inadvertent disclosure caused by technical issues. So the best way to do that is to just make sure that you're constantly updating all of your programs, your software, you're communicating with vendors when you find problems. They patch things regularly as they discover stuff, and the hope is that they discover it before the bad guys discover it. But it doesn't help you if the good guys found it and fixed it and you haven't updated it. That's a vulnerability that you definitely don't want to be responsible for. And in case I haven't sold you on this, you definitely want to do the work now, because it's really, really expensive to have a security event, and particularly a security breach, because like Joseph mentioned earlier, at that moment, you've got to pull in all of your teams to analyze the issue, to isolate the issue, to do an immediate fix. And then you have to kind of pull on the string and unravel the sweater and figure out exactly how bad it was. And then depending on how bad it was, you may have to notify the affected people, you may have to notify all the people, you may have to notify law enforcement, you may have to notify the entire world. And then, it can lead to a lot of other problems beyond just sort of the kind of 2-week emergency, everybody on high alert right after it happens, because you can really damage your reputation in the community in terms of security and sensitivity. How you handle it could potentially impact your reputation. These things can lead to litigation, which is very expensive and extremely inconvenient. I don't know any business owners who are ever excited to be in mine or Joseph's office litigating something. And so, that's a big risk. And then on top of that, you've got the potential for fines from various organizations, attorney generals, you've got the FTC, you've got the various organizations and agencies that oversee the state-specific and industry-specific regulations. And then probably, if you are listening to this, you should have some type of cyber insurance. And if you do, and you have a problem, then odds are good your rates are going to go up. And odds are good that at that particular moment you're gonna pay, because you know how much you need it now. So definitely a lot of good reasons to think about this before you have a problem, enact it before you have a problem, and then make sure that you're taking the time and the expense to do it right, because doing it is not nearly the same as doing it right. And then just a few stories to scare you. Breaches are definitely on the rise. And in particular, small businesses have been having more problems lately. So a long time ago, it was major companies, international companies, huge conglomerates. And it still is some of that. In 2020, a couple of different major hotel chains were hacked. So Marriott International and MGM had like 15 million people had their reservation information hacked, including their addresses and their payment systems and all that stuff. Which is pretty scary. DoorDash, I think at this point in the pandemic, everybody has heard of DoorDash, but they deliver food from local restaurants to your door. And they had a huge data breach in September of 2019. And they got the hackers got 4.9 million customer data records, which was a huge problem for them. And then on top of that, small businesses have become more of a magnet. And I suspect, though I can't prove, that that's because larger businesses are devoting more of their time, energy, and budget to sort of shoring up their defenses. Whereas smaller businesses, particularly, independent businesses that aren't parts of chains, that don't have, they don't operate in, 15 states or overseas, you certainly are less exciting as a target, but that makes you a softer target. And there's been an increase in cyber activity against those softer, smaller targets. And so, IBM had found that the average total cost of a data breach in smaller companies, and they're classified smaller companies as 500 employees or less, has gone, it's in the $2.35 to $2.74 million range in 2020. And they estimate that 43% of data breaches involve small businesses, being that 500 employees or smaller, and that the average cost of a data incident, and not necessarily a data breach, just a data incident, averages $200,000, and that factors in businesses of all sizes. So that includes the multinational, major breaches, but it also includes the data incident at the corner store where, the credit card machine accidentally gives out financial information or something strange, the employee sends something that they shouldn't, all those different things. So there's an awful lot of good reasons to do something about it. And the only reason not to do something about it, I guess, is that you just haven't heard from us yet. So now that you've heard from us, Joseph's going to tell you about when you should start planning and take us home.
Thanks, Risa. So now that you've scared everyone, I think I'm going to offer a little bit of comfort because first, this isn't a situation where there's nothing that you can do. There is, in fact, a lot that you can do to protect yourself. And this isn't necessarily a situation where everyone needs to go out and immediately buy the, equivalent of a Rolls Royce in terms of data protection. Just like not all data is created equal, not all companies are created equal, and not all companies are going to have the same type of data privacy and data security concerns. There are a number of factors that go into it. A huge factor is what type of industry you're in. For example, are you in a highly regulated industry with sensitive data like the financial services industry or the healthcare industry? The education industry, for example, is another industry that has a number of specific data privacy statutes on the books. And of course, if you're not collecting as much data, and if the data that you have is particularly sensitive, then the steps that you need to protect that data are not going to be as significant as someone who's in the other boat. But you should be planning now. And there are a couple reasons. One is because you can help to prevent or at least mitigate the consequences of a data incident or a breach. And as our parents said, and their parents before them, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. And that's certainly the case here, is that there's a lot that can be done early on to protect yourself and your company. So let's start planning now for that reason, but also because it's important to know what might apply to you in terms of the statutes and regulations. And something that Risa hinted at, but that's really important, is that there is a patchwork of laws and regulations across the country and across the world that could potentially apply to your company and to your business. And so a starting point, even if you have a data privacy program in place right now, is to see what are those. Because even if you knew 6 months ago, you might not know now, because this area is really moving so quickly. And I think Risa, for example, is going to talk to us maybe a few months from now or sooner about developments in Virginia that would make the Commonwealth one of the early adopters of statewide data privacy legislation. So it's important to keep up to speed and know what's happening as part of your compliance program, even if you are already ahead of the curve. And so, all of that can save you time, it can save you money in the long run, it can save you needless headache, which is worth its own weight in gold. And it can certainly keep you focused on what it is that you want to do, which is put together a good product or good service to meet a need in the community among your customers. So it's been a real pleasure speaking to you all today. Risa, I thought maybe we would leave our audience with sort of the thing that really interests us in this space right now is food for thought. And, for me, it is the Biometric Information Privacy Act from Illinois and the sort of copycat legislation that has sprung up since then. And the reason why it really interests me is because it's a new frontier of sorts. Biometric information privacy in this context refers to, things like fingerprint information, facial geometry. And there has been all sorts of litigation coming out of Illinois since this has been adopted about the use or rather the misuse of that information. And it has generated just an outsized dollar figure in the form of settlements so far. And some judgments for companies that probably never thought that they would be subject to it. So that's what's really interesting me right now. Risa, what's interesting you?
I find it really interesting how different, so like you said, the patchwork, so the different pieces of the patchwork. I'm actually a quilter, so I like patchwork. But the different pieces, both the different state laws and then the different, sort of overarching themes. I find the enforcement mechanisms and how they differ from each other to be really interesting, because a number of them, don't grant a private right of action. And there is a specific enforcement organization or agency, a lot of times the state's attorneys general, who are responsible for kind of pursuing that. And then in other cases, you do have a private right of action. And obviously that is going to be a much more litigious circumstance. But it has been really interesting to me how that sort of comes about, and how, you know, the sort of the public policy interests that underpin the particular statute or what have you that deals with it, because, you know, it's certainly a very different approach to do one or the other.
Absolutely. And we see that particularly at the statewide level. And I think we will continue to see that until the federal government steps in with a nationwide, broadly applicable privacy law. And we will probably even see the statewide experimentation as we even if that happens. So Risa, it's been a pleasure doing this with you today. We hope that the audience has enjoyed it. Again, I'm Joseph Schaeffer. I'm in Spilman's Pittsburgh office. And Risa, why don't you send us off?
Yes, and I'm Risa Katz-Albert in Spilman, Thomas and Battle's Roanoke office. And thank you very much for listening.
Thanks for joining us. Till next time.